Welcome to Das One Hunt. I'm Jean-Pierre Ruth for Information Week. And in this week's episode, we will be talking about the way the EU has been regulating the tech sector and also comparing that with how regulations in other jurisdictions, primarily the United States, have been influencing and affecting, potentially influencing, affecting, if not potentially stifling, tech innovation. Today, joining me on the podcast, we have Alberto Gimeno, CEO of Invofox. Invofox.
Happens to everybody.
Joining me. And before I get to a full introduction and conversation with Alberto, putting it into context, how things have been going. In recent weeks, we have seen the EU go after Apple, for example, for breaking the Digital Markets Act. The EU also, went after Microsoft regarding its Teams bundling in violation of antitrust law. So there's a plethora of policy that the EU continues to, put in, create, and then is been very, I guess, proactive in actually going forth and enforcing it. There are many other types of things that the EU has kind of laid the groundwork for in terms of how it is going to interact with and kind of the guardrails that it wants to establish when it comes to looking at IT tech companies and how they operate, both in terms of how they operate internally and also how they operate with their customers in those markets. Meanwhile, if you look at regulatory insight that's happening, for example, in the U.S., in some ways it's not been really unified, clear, not as established, and in a lot of ways not really taking this kind of proactive direction, at least at this point. So with today's discussion with Alberto, hoping that we can look at what effect, if any, that from his experience that might be seen from the EU sector in terms of their regulatory scrutiny and their approach to approaching tech companies, and then also getting kind of the perspective of what it's like within the US, and then what that then means for how he operates and what kind of decisions he needs to make. So Alberto, thank you so much for being here on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Right, great. So can you just tell us a bit about Invofox, about like where you how you've operated, where you've kind of like the way you've kind of like territories that you've been in, and was a little bit about some of your experiences, like kind of like firsthand things that you've had to consider, things that you've had to weigh.
Absolutely, yeah. So we are an AI company, and we've been in the AI space before this whole wave got massive, and everybody wanted to do AI and basically put that into their, public communications of any sort. And it's an exciting time to be in this industry. Originally, we are a Spanish corporation. That's how we got started. But when we started getting traction and started getting interest from both investors and clients internationally, we had the opportunity to, kind of step up, and we joined a very prestigious acceleration program for tech companies called Combinator here in San Francisco, where I live right now. And part of the deal here is that you have to relocate the entity. So then we became a US entity, a US corporation with a Spanish subsidiary. So I think we have a bit of experience navigating both markets, both from a regulation perspective and from a business perspective. We have team members and clients in both sides of the Atlantic. I mean, I can't say at the beginning of the conversation you were speaking about Microsoft or Apple. Of course, I can't speak about how those companies are managed, but I can, speak from a young startup with a 50 people team, more or less, point of view, and how we've been able to grow and what kind of challenges we've encountered. And I'm happy to talk about that if that can be relevant.
Yeah, that's absolutely. And I appreciate you making the time for this. Can you give me a sense of the time frames from like your founding and then the relocation of the headquarters to San Francisco, just so we can kind of put in the context
Yeah.
of how much time in the European market and how much of that coincided with the EU's policies coming into play.
Yeah. So I started my first company in Spain in 2015, and Invofox was started later in late 2021. The company, like, we launched our product in early 2022, and it really took off. It started, we had started acquiring customers and growing quite fast. So the whole relocation to the US happened really fast. In 2022, we started the process, and it's a process with some complexities. It took us about a year to get it done, and by the beginning of 2023, we were a US corporation.
Gotcha. Great, great. Thank you for that. So, can you talk a bit from your perspective, what you've seen about the way, yeah, again, not speaking about how so much, the things that have made headlines, but from your perspective, were there things that you started to see in the EU's policy that you're thinking, hey, this might affect like some of the strategies that we were thinking about, or maybe even
Yeah.
reconsidering, or were there even things that you were like, whoa, okay, we can't do X now, at least in the EU, because they've put kind of like closed the doors on that type of approach or that type of action. Of course, it could be. I know there's any number of policies to
Yeah,
that.
absolutely. So there are really many different um, many differences between the US and the EU, both from a business perspective, from a regulation perspective. It just is a completely different market, and it really, at least in our case, it took a while to really figure out some of the details. If we talk about particularly about regulation, I think one of the things that have the most impact is data protection laws, like GDPR in the EU and the regulation also in the United States. So the EU regulation is much more strict, and basically, if you want to operate in the European market, you have to adhere to those rules and figure out how to embed them into your product, into your practices, into your go-to-market. And so, for example, one of the things that it has a direct impact in is go-to-market strategy. It's much more difficult to figure out attribution in the European Union than it is in the United States. By attribution, I mean if you have a website and somehow you get a visitor or even some contact information that they leave on your website, ideally you'd figure out where this person found out about your company. Maybe you have some ad campaign on Facebook or some search campaign on Google or some other thing, or maybe you appeared on a podcast such as this one and someone saw it and they were interested in your company. So ideally you'd figure that out, because what you want to do is really learn what's driving interest in your company and double down there, and that's going to maximize your growth vector, which is what you want to do when you are a young and growing company. So in the EU, that's really difficult to do because of the really hard GDPR regulations, in which basically, what you can do with cookies and with user data, it's, really limited. Whereas in the United States, that is state dependent. So you can't apply the same exact rules to every state, but it does give a lot more wiggle room for you to find out. So I think that is one of the things that it does affect the way companies think about go-to-market. And when you are a European company jump into the US, like we are doing, that we were doing it, like you are still a small organization, so you can't take on a huge regulatory complexity and just change your product the way your product works for every state or for every location, because it's too much to take on. So basically the way we approach it is, all right, well, we're just going to apply the same things we do in Europe. We're going to do the same thing in the US. So basically you are kind of limiting yourself beyond what you would normally have to, but at least you have kind of a homogeneous way to approach go-to-market across all of the geographies where you operate. So there's that. So in a way, you are at a slight competitive disadvantage with local players. But again, you can target both markets with the same strategy. I also think that if the move is happening the other way around, it's an American company trying to target the European market, that's probably harder because whatever you're doing is probably not going to be enough for the European Union. So you actually need to change the way you operate. So it's not going to be, because for us, it was more the decision of actually targeting the US market. We didn't have to change many things, technologically speaking, because we were by default compliant with the US regulation, being it's a softer version of the EU regulation in this aspect. So yeah, that's one of our experiences when it comes to data protection and regulation between these two regions.
Gotcha. And thank you for that. And with your company being in the AI space, with EU's AI policies that they've been developing, have those been anything that would affect you, or is it like the nature of what you're doing? Is it not that kind of like affecting the direction that you're going?
Yeah, I understand what you mean. So as of today, we have not been affected by any regulation. We'll see how it goes. So, I mean, based on past experiences, I assume that at some point we'll feel some impact. I do think that the companies or the products that are going to be the most affected are those using LLMs and models that are based on training in huge and really heterogeneous data samples to perform. And although we, in some cases, use such models, we don't build them ourselves. And the models that we do, like the AI models that we do build ourselves, are based in different AI technologies. And for example, so what my company does is document processing. So basically we take on a PDF, imagine like an invoice, and we parse and validate all of the information that contains. So of course we need examples to train and fine tune our AI models. But what we do is that we use our clients' data to do that, and that's part of the deal. Like we sign a contract with each of our customers and we provide the service and we explain to them, we are going to use this your data to train the AI model because it's going to be, beneficial for you. And they understand that's the way it works. So when you have a, more restrictive B2B approach like we do, I think you are, and also because of the different technological approach, I think it has less of an impact, at least today, but we'll see how that evolves because I see that the tendency or the way that this regulation is shaping up is going to be quite restrictive. So we might end up being impacted in the future.
Gotcha. Have you gotten to a point, has it gotten to a point yet where there's anybody or any part of your team that is really dedicated to just kind of like keeping abreast of, what new regulatory matters you might have to like just kind of look into before you, dive in?
Yeah, so as the company grows, the regulatory complexity really scales. So, for example, in the EU, when you cross a certain number of employees, you are suddenly subject to, lots of regulations regarding mostly HR issues like diversity and equity and keeping tabs with all of that. And it's not just about having the right policies in place, which I do believe we all should, but it's about doing it in a certain way that allows you to actually demonstrate it. So it adds up. It is a lot of complexity, and you have to spend a lot of money and a lot of time of people working in your company to figure that out and do it properly. And not only that, but also as you grow and you start working with larger, more mature customers that might end up using your solution, like it's happening to us, you now have to also stay compliant with, for example, standard certifications. Like, for example, in our case, we got ISO 27001 certified in the European Union, and we're about to get SOC 2 certified in the US. So basically, you do need people that are focused on compliance to be able to stay compliant with those two frameworks.